In the decades following 1816 across North America and parts of Europe, a particular type of building began appearing in unexpected places. County courthouses, federal post offices, administrative centers built from granite and limestone, with columns, domed roofs, and interiors designed for hundreds of daily visitors. They appeared in settlements with populations measured in dozens. In 1822, a courthouse was completed in an Ohio township with 47 registered residents. The building contained 3 courtrooms, a records vault, and a public assembly hall capable of seating 300. Construction had begun 2 years prior, when the township had 11 families. The stone was quarried 60 miles away. The timber framing used techniques typically reserved for structures expected to last centuries. By 1840, this pattern had repeated across 19 states. The official explanation is straightforward. These buildings were constructed with future growth in mind. Local governments, flush with land sale revenue and federal appropriations, built infrastructure ahead of settlement. It was speculation in brick and mortar, an investment in inevitable expansion. But the numbers create friction. In 1828, a federal courthouse opened in western Pennsylvania serving a judicial district with 340 documented residents. The building's construction cost exceeded $47,000, equivalent to roughly $4 million today. The structure included gas lighting infrastructure, though the town wouldn't have a gas works until 1851. It had a basement archive designed to hold 50 years of legal records, though the district had been formally organized only 8 months before construction began. The building was sized for a population of 8,000. The town reached that population in 1891, 63 years later. This is a documentary exploration of historical architecture, institutional patterns, and infrastructure timing. It examines physical evidence, construction records, and census data. It does not make claims about hidden civilizations or suppressed history. It asks why certain buildings feel disconnected from the communities they were built to serve, and whether that disconnection tells us something we've overlooked. In 1835, a Missouri county with fewer than 200 residents received a stone courthouse with a bell tower visible for 12 miles. The bell itself weighed 1,400 pounds and had been cast in Philadelphia. Transportation alone cost more than the county's annual tax revenue. The building's foundation went 9 feet deep, engineered for soil subsidence that wouldn't occur in that region for another generation, after drainage patterns changed due to railroad construction in the 1870s. The architect's name appears in no local records. The design matches courthouse templates used in Virginia, Tennessee, and Illinois during the same period. Not similar. Identical floor plans. Identical column spacing. Identical roof pitch. As though drawn from a shared standard that no one bothered to write down. Or that was written down and has since been lost. In Vermont, a federal postal facility opened in 1829 in a township with 93 residents. The structure featured sorting infrastructure designed for 1,200 daily pieces of mail. In its first year of operation, it processed an average of 11 letters per day. The building had office space for 8 postal workers. For the first 9 years, 1 postmaster worked alone. The construction timing is notable. Between 1818 and 1842, the United States federal government commissioned the construction of over 340 district administrative buildings, courthouses, customs houses, and postal facilities, in areas classified as territories or newly incorporated counties. The vast majority were completed before the surrounding townships reached 500 residents. 70% were built to specifications that anticipated populations 10 to 20 times the actual settlement. Census data from the period shows something unusual. In counties where these buildings appeared, population growth in the first decade averaged 340%. In counties without such buildings, growth averaged 80%. The buildings didn't just anticipate growth. They seemed to precede it, as though their presence was the catalyst rather than the response. But that raises a timing problem. If these structures were built to attract settlers, why were they designed with such immediate functionality? A building meant to lure future residents would be symbolic, impressive but minimal inside. These were operational from day one. climate-controlled archive rooms, multiple courtrooms, staff quarters, holding cells, record vaults with iron-reinforced doors, infrastructure for a system already running. In Kentucky, a circuit courthouse completed in 1831 included a law library with shelving for 4,000 volumes. The County Bar Association had 3 registered attorneys. The library received its first donation, 22 books, in 1833. The shelving remained empty for decades, yet it was built into the original design. Load-bearing walls, custom woodwork, iron brackets anchored into stone. Someone expected those shelves to fill. Across the Atlantic, a similar pattern appeared in Scotland and northern England during the same window. Between 1825 and 1845, county administrative buildings were constructed in rural regions at a pace that outstripped population growth by a significant margin. A courthouse in the Scottish borders, completed in 1829, served a district with 410 residents. It had capacity for 1,500. The architectural language was nearly identical to buildings being constructed simultaneously in New York, Pennsylvania, and Ohio. Same proportions, same stone-cutting techniques, same neoclassical grammar. This isn't about conspiracy. It's about timing, scale, and coordination. About buildings that feel like they arrived before the need existed, designed by systems that seem to already be in place, funded by mechanisms that were surprisingly robust for regions still considered frontier. And about the possibility that the story we tell about 19th century expansion, the infrastructure didn't stop at courthouses. In 1825, the Erie Canal opened across 363 miles of New York State. It connected the Great Lakes to the Atlantic Ocean, cutting through regions where, in many stretches, fewer than 50 people lived per square mile. The engineering required 83 locks, 18 aqueducts, and excavation through bedrock using black powder and hand tools. The canal was designed to handle 400 boats simultaneously. In its first year of operation, 13 boats made regular trips. The capacity existed decades before the demand arrived. By 1850, the canal was operating near its design maximum. But in 1825, when it opened, the volume it was built to manage didn't exist. The boats hadn't been constructed yet. The cargo networks weren't established. The population centers it connected were still forming. Yet the infrastructure assumed they were already there. This wasn't isolated optimism. It was a pattern. Between 1828 and 1848, the United States saw the construction of over 9,000 miles of railroad track. Much of it laid through territories with populations under 1,000. The tracks were standard gauge 4 feet 5 inches, a measurement that became uniform across the country with remarkable speed, despite no federal mandate until 1863. The coordination happened quietly. Regional rail companies, operating independently, adopted the same specifications: track width, tie spacing, gradient limits, signal systems. By 1842, a freight car built in Virginia could roll unmodified onto tracks in Ohio, Pennsylvania, or Illinois. The integration felt premature. In 1830, a grain storage facility was constructed in rural Indiana with a capacity of 40,000 bushels. The county's total annual grain production that year was 8,000 bushels. The facility included a mechanized elevator system, iron-reinforced bins, and a rail siding that connected to tracks that wouldn't be laid for another 4 years. The builder's name is recorded. The funding source is not. In England, between 1832 and 1847, over 200 county courthouses and municipal buildings were either newly constructed or drastically expanded. These projects occurred during a period of economic contraction, the Hungry 40s, when rural populations were declining due to urbanization and agricultural mechanization. The buildings were being erected as people were leaving. Yet the designs assumed growth. A courthouse in Lincolnshire, completed in 1838, included administrative offices for a county staff of 40. The county employed 7 officials at the time. The building had dedicated spaces for departments that didn't formally exist until the 1870s: sanitation oversight, education coordination, public works administration. Rooms built for roles that hadn't been created yet. The architectural precision is notable. These weren't rough frontier structures. The joinery was exact. The stone cutting showed advanced technique. The interior layouts reflected an understanding of institutional workflow, how documents moved between departments, how public access was separated from administrative function, how record security was maintained. These were buildings designed by people who understood bureaucracy. The question isn't whether the buildings were impressive. It's whether the administrative systems they housed existed at the scale the buildings implied. In 1834, a customs house opened in Portland, Maine, designed to process import documentation for 200 vessels per month. Portland's port handled 19 vessels that year. The building included bonded storage for high-value cargo, inspection bays, and office space for 12 customs officials. The staff consisted of one customs collector and an assistant. The infrastructure anticipated a system operating at 10 times the actual scale. Water systems present similar timing. Between 1835 and 1855, over 60 American cities installed municipal water infrastructure. Reservoirs, aqueducts, underground piping, designed for populations significantly larger than current census figures. Philadelphia's Fairmount Water Works, completed in 1815, could supply 20 million gallons per day. The city's population at the time required 3 million. The excess capacity took 40 years to approach full utilization. In Britain, the pattern mirrored. The London sewer system, designed by Joseph Bazalgette and constructed between 1859 and 1875, was built to serve a population of 4 million. London's population in 1860 was 2.8 million. Bazalgette designed for growth, certainly, but the scale of overengineering was noted even at the time. His specifications assumed population densities that wouldn't be reached until the early 20th century. He built for a city that didn't yet exist. The administrative coordination is equally striking. By 1840, county record-keeping systems across the United States had achieved remarkable uniformity. Birth records, land deeds, court proceedings, tax assessments, all followed standardized formats. The forms were nearly identical whether issued in Massachusetts, Georgia, or Michigan. No federal standardization mandate existed until 1902. Yet the consistency was already in place. In 1843, a fire insurance map was published for a Pennsylvania town of 340 residents. The map showed building footprints, construction materials, and risk classifications using a symbology system that matched maps being produced simultaneously in New York, Maryland, and Ohio. The system was detailed, comprehensive, and apparently already in use across multiple states. Someone had established the standard. The courthouses fit into this broader infrastructure pattern. They weren't anomalies. They were components of a system that appeared coordinated, architecturally, administratively, and temporally. Roads were graded to specifications that anticipated heavy freight traffic. Bridges were built with load capacities far exceeding the wagon weights of the 1830s. Telegraph lines, when they arrived in the 1840s, followed routes that seemed pre-planned, connecting administrative centers with efficiency that suggested prior surveying. The network felt like it was being completed, not started. Whether this reflects inherited infrastructure from an earlier organizational system, or simply represents an extraordinary level of speculative planning by early American institutions, the physical evidence raises questions about how we understand the pace of 19th-century expansion. The buildings remain. The records remain. The timing remains. And the term that some have begun using to describe the period before these systems were officially established, the word Tartaria, appears on European maps beginning in the 13th century. It was a geographic designation, not a specific nation. The term referred to the vast Central Asian steppes, regions inhabited by various Turkic and Mongolic peoples. By the 18th century, mapmakers used Tartaria loosely to describe territories stretching from the Caspian Sea to Siberia. It was a label for land that European cartographers understood incompletely. The term faded from official use by the mid-1800s, replaced by more precise national and regional names as surveying improved and political boundaries solidified. By 1850, Tartaria had largely disappeared from authoritative maps. but the timing is worth noting. The term's disappearance from cartography coincides almost exactly with the period of institutional and infrastructural expansion discussed here, the decades between 1815 and 1850. Some have begun using Tartaria not as a historical claim, but as a placeholder, a shorthand for asking whether the administrative systems and architectural networks that appeared so rapidly during this period were entirely new, or whether they represented a reorganization of something older. Three interpretive frameworks exist. The first is conventional. These buildings and systems were the product of speculative investment, federal funding, and coordinated planning by early 19th century governments anticipating westward expansion and population growth. The over-engineering reflected optimism, available capital from land sales, and a belief in inevitable progress. The architectural consistency came from shared training among builders, pattern books, and the influence of neoclassical design trends spreading from Europe. This explanation accounts for most of the evidence. The second framework suggests institutional inheritance. It proposes that certain administrative structures, record-keeping systems, and infrastructural templates weren't invented in the 1820s but were adapted from earlier organizational models, possibly from colonial administrations, European governance systems, or trading company frameworks that had been operating in these regions before formal American expansion. The buildings weren't built for populations that didn't exist. They were built for systems that were already quietly functioning. This interpretation reframes timing without requiring hidden history. The third perspective is more speculative. It treats Tartaria as a metaphor for discontinuity, the possibility that the official narrative of 19th century development compresses or obscures an earlier phase of organization. Not a lost empire, but an administrative reconfiguration. A period where existing infrastructure was relabeled, repurposed, or formally claimed by new governments after disruptions caused by events like the 1815 eruption of Mount Tambora, the year without a summer in 1816, and the subsequent social reorganization. This view asks whether expansion is the right word, or whether reoccupation might be more accurate. None of these interpretations require conspiracy. They simply offer different ways of understanding the relationship between infrastructure, population, and institutional memory. The year without a summer sits at the center of this question. In 1816, following the eruption of Mount Tambora in present-day Indonesia, global temperatures dropped. Crops failed across Europe and North America. Famine spread. Populations migrated. Social systems destabilized. By 1818, recovery had begun. And within that recovery, the institutional construction boom started. If the buildings being erected in the 1820s were entirely new, their scale and coordination are remarkable given the economic disruption that had just occurred. If they represented reorganization of existing infrastructure, their sudden formalization makes more sense. The question isn't whether Tartaria was real as a civilization. It's whether the administrative and architectural landscape of the early 19th century emerged entirely from that moment, or whether it carried forward elements from before the disruption. The evidence invites examination, not conclusion. In Vermont, the 1829 postal facility still stands. Its sorting infrastructure, designed for 1,200 daily pieces of mail, is original. In Ohio, the 1822 courthouse operates as a county building today, its 3 courtrooms still in use. In Pennsylvania, the 1828 federal courthouse became a historical landmark in 1964. Researchers studying its construction found foundation stones showing where patterns inconsistent with the building's official age, stones that appeared to have been quarried, used elsewhere, and then repurposed. Physical evidence that raises more questions than it answers. The courthouses of this period don't feel like frontier architecture. They feel like administrative infrastructure for a system already running, formalized, documented, and recognized after the fact. Whether that system was a continuation of colonial frameworks, a reorganization following climate disruption, or simply aggressive speculation by governments betting on growth, the buildings themselves remain. And they remain over-engineered. The term Tartaria, in its modern reinterpretation, isn't asking whether a hidden empire existed. It's asking whether the timeline we accept for institutional development might be more compressed, more coordinated, or more dependent on prior systems than the standard narrative suggests? It's a question about continuity. In 1831, the Kentucky courthouse with shelving for 4,000 law books finally began receiving volumes in significant numbers. By 1890, the shelves were full. The architect's original design had assumed capacity that took 60 years to justify. Was that foresight? Or knowledge? The difference matters. The buildings don't provide answers. They provide evidence that the answers we've accepted might be incomplete. That infrastructure appearing before demand might not always be speculative. That architectural consistency across vast regions might imply coordination we haven't fully documented. That the period between 1816 and 1850 might represent something more complex than simple expansion. The courthouses remain standing. Their stone is real. Their dimensions are measurable. Their timing is documented. What remains uncertain is whether they were built for a future that hadn't arrived, or a past that hadn't entirely left. The evidence is there. The questions are open. And the label we use, whether Tartaria, reorganization, or inheritance, matters less than the willingness to examine what the buildings themselves are saying. They were designed for something. The question is whether that something was ahead of them or behind them.